My wife came home 3 days after she died. No matter what anyone tells you, please know that my wife is dead. We had been married for 4 years. She loved me enough to move halfway across the country with me. Leaving behind Maine and moving to a small rural town in South Dakota was difficult for her. But she grew to love our quiet peace of nowhere. Jess loved the slower pace of life that South Dakota granted, and so did I. It allowed me to focus more on our relationship. I nearly lost Jess once before. In college, my drinking got so bad that I stopped recognizing the man in the mirror. She stayed anyway. She helped me get sober. She gave me a future when I deserved neither. It was her kindness and patience that got me through. And when our life in South Dakota began, I made a promise to myself that I would make the most of every moment I had with Jess. 2 weeks ago, Jess headed back to Maine for a weekend girls' trip with her sisters. Since she hardly got to see her family anymore, I supported her decision to take the trip, though I told her I would miss her like crazy. She smiled, leaned in for a kiss, and said, "I'll be back before you know it." Less than an hour after she left, I got a call from my fishing buddy, Sheriff Miller. "Hey, Sheriff, you want to get together tonight for some fishing? The wife is out of town, so I'm free." I answered casually. A sober voice responded, "Devin, I'm real sorry to have to be the one to tell you this, but there's been an accident on Highway 9 by the intersection. I think you should come down here." My heart dropped as I hung up and headed out to Highway 9. As I approached, I saw the bright flashing lights of 4 police cars, 2 fire trucks, and 1 ambulance. My hands shook violently as I exited my car and jogged over to the scene. In the middle of the intersection, I could see a semi with its front end smashed in on itself and smoke rising from its exposed engine. I walked up to Sheriff Miller. When he saw me, he removed his hat, and with tears in his eyes, he said, "Devin, I'm so sorry." In a panic, I glanced past him to the torn-up cornfield just off the road. In the middle of damaged and flattened corn stalks rested the crumbled remains of Jess's 2019 Subaru. I screamed and wept as I saw the paramedics walk a covered stretcher to the awaiting ambulance. Even beneath the sheet, I could tell that the body it carried was mangled and bent in ways unnatural for the human form. Weeping, I fell to the ground as the sheriff knelt next to me. He told me he knew how hard this is, but he really needed me to come with him to the medical examiners to positively identify the body. So, he helped me to his car, and we both followed the ambulance. I sat in the hallway for what felt like hours before they called me back to view the body. Tears again filled my eyes as they lifted the sheet. It was her. It was my Jess. The crash had knocked one of her eyes loose in its socket, and her jaw was mangled and hung loose. But it was her. The next couple of days were a blur of conversations with the funeral home, the local pastor, and Jess's family, who took the first flight to South Dakota. The funeral was on Sunday afternoon. The whole town came. The pastor spoke about the value of life and the sadness of death. As the casket was lowered to the ground, I sat there staring into the void. Slowly, family and friends began to leave. But not me. I stayed. I watched the workers fill the grave. I watched the last of the dirt disappear beneath the setting sun. And when I finally drove home, I did so knowing one thing with absolute certainty. My wife was dead. It was dark when I got home. My parents and Jess's parents both begged me to come over to the hotel so that we could grieve together. But I told them I needed to be alone. In reality, I didn't want them to stop me from drinking away my pain. Several bottles later, I sat alone in the darkness of my living room, as drunk as could be, but still unable to forget. That's when I heard the front door unlock. It took me a moment to realize what I was hearing. It was the low jingle of keys, followed by someone fumbling to fit the key in the lock, then a loud click. Next, the front door swung open, flooding the entryway with moonlight. I stared through groggy eyes as a familiar silhouette filled the doorway. A voice I never thought I'd hear again said, "Why is it so dark in here?" before calling out for me. "Devin, are you home, honey?" I couldn't believe my eyes. This can't be her. "Who are you?" I said with slurred words. At that, she jumped slightly, startled by my words coming from the darkness. She turned on the hallway light and saw me in the chair. "What do you mean, who are you?" "It's me, your wife," she said playfully before following up with, "Why are you sitting in the dark?" I had no words. I simply stared at her in disbelief. Her eyes glanced down to the empty bottles on the floor, and a frown formed on her face. "Really, Devin? I leave for 3 days, and you start doing this again? I thought we were past this." I slowly stood to my feet and took a wobbly step towards her. "I don't know who you are, but this isn't funny. Jess is dead. Leave me alone." "What are you talking about?" she said in an annoyed tone. "I'm not dead. I was visiting sisters, don't you remember?" I stumbled forward towards her. "Jess is dead." She laughed. "Okay, you've definitely had too much to drink. I literally talked to you from Bangor yesterday." "You're not real," I mumbled as my eyes grew foggy and I collapsed in a drunken stupor. The next morning, I woke with a splitting headache. I wasn't sure how I had gotten to bed, but I lay there staring up at the ceiling. The grief of the last few days returned, and I sighed as the reality of life without Jess returned. As I pulled myself out of bed, I told myself I would go over to my parents' hotel later that day. As I got dressed, I noticed a strange smell in the room, not the scent of alcohol that I expected. Instead, it smelled vaguely of rotting leaves and mold. I cracked open a window before heading downstairs. My whole body tensed up as I walked into the kitchen, and there stood Jess. She was humming to herself as she poured a cup of coffee. I swallowed hard before opening my mouth. "Jess?" She turned and smiled. It was her face, her bright blue eyes, her bright white teeth and dirty blonde hair. In that moment, I didn't know what to believe. 3 days ago, I looked into the same face, broken and lifeless. But now, here she was, smiling at me, as if nothing had happened. "Morning," came her energetic voice. "I have to go into the office here shortly, but I made you some coffee and here's some aspirin. I'm sure you're feeling a bit hungover." All I could do was nod. "Last night wasn't great. We can talk about it later, but it doesn't have to be a big deal. Let's just move on." "Okay, sounds good," I managed to say. She walked by me to get to the garage. As she did, she kissed me on the cheek. Her lips were cold. "I love you," she said as she walked out the door. For a moment, I just stood there in the kitchen. My pounding headache made it even harder to understand what was going on. Had I, in a drunken state, imagined that my wife had died? No, I couldn't have. I was there. I smelled the burning flesh and saw the body. But if I wasn't imagining her death, then who was I just talking to? It looked like Jess. It sounded like her too. My memories tell me that she is dead, but my eyes tell me that she's alive. So which one do I believe? Maybe someone else can tell me. I muttered aloud as I reached for the phone. Hey, Devin. Sheriff Miller's jolly voice came through the phone. You want to get together tonight for some fishing? The wife is working a late shift and I get done around 5 if you're free. Sheriff, it's Jess. What about her? The accident. Silence. Devin. What accident? Is Jess okay? I could feel anger boiling within me. What do you mean? You were there. Friday you called me to tell me she had died in an accident. We just buried her yesterday. He was silent again before saying, Dev, are you feeling okay? What the hell is that supposed to mean? Well, what I mean is, we didn't have a funeral this weekend, at least not one I was aware of. And the last lethal accident around here was the Harrison family last summer. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Miller continued in a lower tone. Have you been drinking again? Look, if you need help, I'll give you the number of that rehab center in Middleton. Without another word, I ended the call. Next, I called my parents. And though I had seen them yesterday at the funeral, they claimed they hadn't left Maine in months. For the next hour, I scoured the internet, trying to find any news coverage of the accident or an online obituary. But there wasn't any trace of the events of this last weekend anywhere online. I then found myself searching the house for the bulletin from the funeral service, or maybe one of the many "sorry for your loss" cards I had received. But there was nothing. No cards, no notes, not so much as a scrap of paper from the funeral home. Nothing. By noon, I felt like I was losing my mind, and my last evidence of my wife dying could only be found at the funeral home. So I walked 4 blocks over to the funeral home. As I entered, I was greeted at the front desk by an elderly man wearing a 3-piece suit. Good afternoon, sir. How may I help you? He said in a shaky yet soothing voice. Yeah, hi. I was wondering if I have ever done any business here. He raised one eyebrow and asked, You've forgotten if you've done business with a funeral home? Yeah. I was just wondering if you could check my name against your files. Very well. What is your name? After giving him my name, he typed it into the computer and said, It seems that this last Saturday you purchased 1 burial plot in the East Field. Is that ringing any bells? I nodded. Yeah, it is. Could you give me the lot number? I'd like to check that it's the one I wanted. He wrote it on a sticky note and handed it to me. I didn't really need the lot number. I knew exactly where Jess's grave was. I walked out into the East Field but was shocked to find that the beautiful headstone that Jess's parents and I bought was no longer there. It was an empty lot. The ground had clearly been disturbed recently, but there was no headstone. I double-checked the number to be sure it was right, and it was. I found myself staring vacantly at the lot. And as I did, a small thought in the back of my mind began to grow. I must have made it up. By the time I walked home, it was nearing dinner time. As I approached my house, I saw Jess's Subaru in the drive. Another detail disproved my memories. I took a deep breath and braced myself before walking inside. Seeing Jess still was a shock to my system. I could hear Jess. She was in the kitchen, humming to herself as she did in the morning. I could feel my heart beat faster as I walked. Jess had made herself dinner and was just about to start eating when she noticed me walking in. She gave a wide smile and said, "Hey, you, how was your day?" This felt weird. I forced a smile. "It was good. How was yours?" "Incredible," she said as she turned to grab her plate. "What are you eating?" I asked awkwardly. "Oh, I needed some protein, so I cooked up a few of the steaks from the freezer," she replied as she took a greedy bite out of one of the steaks. I gazed at her uncomfortably before saying, "Jess, you're a vegetarian. You don't eat meat." At this, she stopped chewing for a moment and looked like a child looks when they're caught in a lie. We awkwardly stared at one another before she smiled and said, "Well, I'm just trying new things. Who knows? Maybe I'll become a carnivore instead." She laughed wildly with a mouth full of meat. "It's pretty good. You should try some." I shook my head, but she lifted the fork with a piece of steak to my mouth, pressing it gently against my closed lips. "Come on, you'll love it," she said with wide eyes. Reluctantly, I took a little nibble of the meat. "See? Isn't that so good?" The cheerfulness of her voice didn't match the violence of her eyes. For a while she stared at me with her wide, unblinking eyes before turning and saying, "Well, that's enough for me. Time to go take a shower." I stayed downstairs until I heard the shower turn off. After gathering my courage, I walked up to the bedroom. In the master bath, Jess sat by the mirror in fresh pajamas, drying her hair. Her head turned to me as I walked in. I swallowed hard before asking, "Are you Jess?" Vacant eyes looked back at me before a toothy grin appeared. "I'm your wife," she replied. "That's not what I asked." She stared a moment longer before shrugging and turning back to the mirror. I turned and retreated to the basement, shutting the door behind me. I tried to calm my nerves with some TV. A few hours later, I finally felt brave enough to leave the basement. I might not want to sleep in the same room as her, but Jess acting weird wasn't going to keep me in the basement. I stood up from the couch and turned around. As I did, my blood froze. Directly behind the couch, standing as still as a statue, was Jess. I don't know how long she had been there. I hadn't heard the basement door open. She stood staring deep into my eyes, head slightly tilted to the right, with a gentle yet malicious grin on her face. "Oh, Jess, I hadn't heard you come down," I said nervously. Silence followed. "What are you doing down here?" she said in a melodic tone barely louder than a whisper. "I had to get out of there. I was just about to watch some shows, but my boss called me saying they need me to cover the night shift, so I gotta go." She glared at me in silence for what felt like an eternity before replying. "Okay. I hope you have a good shift." She then turned to the side to allow me access to the stairs. As I walked up the stairs, I could feel her warm breath on my neck as she followed close behind. Trying to stay calm, I found my wallet and keys before saying, "Bye, honey." She didn't respond. I resisted the urge to run to my car. As I turned the key, I breathed a sigh of relief. The real Jess would have known that I had been out of work for months. I felt convinced that that wasn't my wife, but I had to be sure. Jess stood in the window watching as I backed out and pulled away. I had to know. I had to know what happened to my wife and what was now in my house. And only one place would give me answers. So I stopped at the local hardware store and bought a shovel. I then waited till 1 a.m. when I was sure no one was out. Parking a little ways away, I cautiously walked to the east field of the cemetery. Something was buried in my lot. There was no headstone, but the dirt had clearly been moved. So I started digging. It must have been past 3 a.m. when my shovel hit the hard concrete of a burial vault. My lot had something in it. I took the time to clear off the rest of the vault lid before climbing out of the grave to run back to my car for a sledgehammer. Within the hour, I was covered in sweat. But the majority of the vault cover was gone or loose. Beneath the smashed pieces of concrete, I could see a coffin. The same deep red oak coffin I had picked out for my wife 3 days ago. When the opening was big enough, I took the leap of no return and began smashing the beautiful box with the head of the shovel. As I punctured the lid, the odor of death escaped, and I recoiled in disgust. After holding back vomit, I returned to work and pried the lid open. My eyes widened as I peered inside. Buried in my wife's casket was the mangled and deformed body of a decaying deer. Its limbs were twisted and broken to fit in the box, its neck snapped and violently bent to the side. Its lifeless eyes were foggy, and maggots crawled every inch of the carcass. On one of its antlers, it wore a ring. It was my wife's wedding ring. Though it was covered with dried blood and fur, it was still as beautiful as the day I gave it to her. I don't remember the drive back to the house. I only remember standing in the driveway before dawn, staring at the kitchen light glowing through the curtains. Every instinct told me to leave. Instead, I went inside. The house smelled stronger now. Wet earth, rotting leaves, something dug up and left in the sun. Jess was sitting at the kitchen table. She wasn't eating. She wasn't reading. She was simply waiting. Her eyes followed me as I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked down at my hand, at the wedding ring. The smile slowly faded from her face. "Oh," she said quietly. The single word sounded more disappointed than angry. I took a step backward. "What are you?" I whispered. She tilted her head. The movement went too far, her neck bending several inches past what should have been possible. "I'm your wife." "No." For the first time since she'd appeared, she stopped smiling entirely. Something dark moved behind her eyes, but the voice tried to be kind. "You weren't supposed to dig." The voice was almost hers, almost. I backed toward the door. She made no effort to stop me. Instead, she folded her hands on the table and watched. As I reached the doorway, she spoke one last time. "Devin?" I froze. "When you get lonely enough." A grin stretched across her face. "You'll come back." I left and never looked back. Since then, I've tried to move on. I'm working part-time in a new city in a different state. My wife is gone, even though no one believes me. I'm both grieving and terrified. Because every now and then, I get voicemails from unknown numbers. It's the same message every time. In the voice of my wife, barely holding back laughter, the thing says, "Devin, when are you coming home?"